Could a modern president survive frontier America? Before the White House, they lived like pioneers. They split rails, cleared forests, worked farms, broke horses, lost parents, slept in cabins, walked through mud, and worked until dark. They were not all raised inside political families or polished Eastern rooms. Some learned endurance beside an axe handle, responsibility behind a team, and reading only after the day's labor was finished. The frontier shaped them long before politics ever did. These are 7 presidents who carried it all the way to Washington. Number 7. Millard Fillmore, the Apprentice. In the Finger Lakes County of New York, the soil on Nathaniel Fillmore's rented farm was thin, stony, and stubborn. The family worked it because there was nothing else to work. Millard, the eldest son, received little regular schooling. A farm needed hands more than it needed scholars. And a boy old enough to carry, dig, and cut was old enough to help keep the family fed. When Millard was 14, his father bound him as an apprentice to a clothmaker. Apprenticeship was supposed to teach a trade. It could also place a boy almost entirely under another man's control. Fillmore later remembered the arrangement as harsh and unjust. He worked around wool, carding equipment, wet cloth, and the steady mechanical drag of a trade he did not want. The air would have carried the oily smell of fleece and dye. The machine did not care whether the boy beside it had ambitions. But Fillmore bought a small English dictionary. It was the first book he owned. While tending the carding machine, he studied it. Word by word, he was building an education in a room meant to turn him into a laborer. He eventually borrowed $30, bought his release from the apprenticeship, and walked roughly 100 miles home. Then he sought out schools, borrowed books, taught classes, and studied law, where he could find the chance. Here's what this story reveals about frontier education. The problem was not always that people lacked intelligence. They lacked time, teachers, books, and permission to use them. Learning often had to be taken in fragments, before work, after dark, or while a machine was still running. Fillmore's presidency would be marked by compromise, caution, and an instinct for orderly solutions. Those habits did not begin in Washington. They began with a boy trapped inside an arrangement he could not simply abandon, studying the meaning of words until he could negotiate his own way out. The frontier did not give Millard Fillmore an education. It taught him to build one from scraps. Number 6. James K. Polk, the frontier farmer's son. Polk was 10 years old when his family loaded a wagon and left North Carolina for Tennessee in 1806. The trip covered nearly 500 miles. There were no interstates crossing the Appalachians, no bridge at every watercourse, and no repair shop waiting beyond the next ridge. A wagon wheel, an axle, a lame animal, or a week of rain could change the entire journey. When the Polks reached the Duck River country, they entered a region still being turned into farms and settlements. Forests had to be cut, stumps had to be worked around or burned out, fences had to be built before livestock wandered through a crop. A functioning farm was not found waiting in the wilderness. It was imposed on it, one measured piece at a time. Polk's story was not the familiar log cabin tale of lifelong poverty. His father, Samuel, became a prosperous planter and landowner. Enslaved people performed much of the labor that made that prosperity possible. That fact belongs in the record. James grew up seeing both the discipline of frontier construction and the unequal human system underneath it. He was also a sickly boy. In 1812, he traveled to Kentucky for surgery by the frontier physician, Ephraim McDowell, to remove urinary stones. This was before modern anesthesia and sterile operating rooms. Polk survived, recovered, and threw himself into study with the same severe order that governed the household around him. What did the frontier give him? Not the easy toughness of a boy who loved outdoor labor. Polk was small, often ill, and better suited to a desk. What he absorbed was the frontier's habit of turning enormous goals into a sequence of tasks. Clear this ground. Mark this boundary, finish this season's work, then move to the next tract. As president, Polk entered office with 4 major objectives and pursued them with relentless discipline. That same drive expanded the United States to the Pacific, while war with Mexico and the seizure of Western territory left consequences that cannot be separated from the achievement. The frontier taught Polk to see expansion as work to be finished, even when other people paid the price. Number 5. Herbert Hoover, the Iowa Orphan. One of Herbert Hoover's clearest childhood memories came from the blacksmith shop across from his family's small cottage in West Branch, Iowa. He was barefoot, as frontier children often were in warm weather, moving around the forge while his father worked. Hoover stepped on a chip of hot iron. The burn scar remained on his foot for life. He later called it the brand of Iowa. The shop was a place of sparks, hammer blows, coal smoke, horses, plows, and farm wagons waiting for repair. His father, Jesse, was known as an industrious and fair blacksmith. The work served an entire rural community. A broken plow point could stop a farmer. A loose horseshoe could halt a trip. Usefulness was not an abstract virtue in West Branch. It was what kept other families moving. Then the security of Hoover's childhood disappeared. His father died when Herbert was 6. His mother died 3 years later. Herbert and his siblings were divided among relatives. At 11, he left Iowa by train for Oregon to live with his uncle, John Minthorn. He would never again live in the town where he had been born. Hoover later described Iowa through streams, woods, crops, chores, worship, and the close obligations of a Quaker settlement. Yet, orphanhood taught him the other side of frontier family life. When parents died, there was no public safety net waiting at the door. Kin took children in. Households stretched. A child learned quickly whether he could make himself useful. By 14, he had left regular schooling to clerk in his uncle's land office. He learned bookkeeping, organization, and the quiet arithmetic behind property and survival. Years later, when war left millions of Europeans dependent on food relief, Hoover approached hunger as a problem of rail cars, ships, warehouses, flour, and exact quantities. The scale had changed. The instinct had not. The frontier did not promise Herbert Hoover security. It taught him to become useful wherever he was sent. So far, the frontier has looked like a hard teacher, a machine that would not stop, a wagon crossing mountains, a family broken by death. But the next 4 men did not merely grow up around frontier labor. They put their own bodies into it, on a towpath, behind a team, in a prison camp, and behind an axe that rose and fell for years. Number 4. James A. Garfield, the Canal Boy. At 16, James Garfield wanted the sea. He had grown up on a small Ohio farm carved from the Western Reserve. His father died when James was 18 months old, leaving Eliza Garfield and her children to hold the place together. The boy read adventure stories and looked north toward Lake Erie. In 1848, he chopped 100 cords of wood on a farm within sight of the lake, watching sails move across the blue distance. Farm work felt like confinement. Garfield went to Cleveland and tried to hire onto a vessel. The sailors laughed the raw farm boy off the deck, so he took the lowest job he could find on the water, driving the mules that pulled a canal boat. As Garfield later put it, if canal work stood at the bottom of sailing, mule driving stood at the bottom of canal work. Picture the towpath, mud sucking at boots, mule harness creaking, a narrow boat sliding beside him at walking speed. The tow line might snag, an animal might shy. A careless step could put him in the canal, and Garfield never became a strong swimmer. His grand adventure lasted only about 6 weeks. Repeated mishaps and a bout of malaria sent him home feverish and defeated. His mother did not treat the failure as the end of the story. She used $17, nearly all she had saved, to help send him to Geauga Seminary. Garfield cleaned, taught, studied, and took whatever work allowed him to remain near books. The canal had shown him what unskilled labor demanded from a man hour after hour. Education was no longer a vague improvement, but a road away from the towpath. Frontier America produced countless people who wore out their bodies because no other route opened. Garfield's remarkable step was not that he escaped labor. It was that he carried its discipline into the classroom. He rose from student to teacher, then college principal, without ever forgetting the farm and canal that had paid the first price. The canal did not carry James Garfield out of hardship. It showed him that education was the road out. Number 3. Ulysses S. Grant, the Horseman. When Ulysses Grant was 7 or 8, his family began sending him out with the wagon to haul wood for the house and his father's shops. He was too small to load it. The choppers did that. But the boy could take the reins, guide the team over rough Ohio roads, wait while the wagon was stacked, and bring it home. By 11, Grant wrote he was strong enough to hold a plow. From then until he left for West Point at 17, nearly every farm job involving horses belonged to him. Breaking ground, furrowing fields, plowing corn and potatoes, hauling crops, hauling wood, feeding the animals, and keeping the work moving while he still attended school. Grant hated his father's tannery. The vats, hides, blood, and heavy smell repelled him. Horses were different. Frightened or stubborn animal could not be bullied into reliable work. The person holding the reins had to notice tension before it became panic. He had to apply pressure without losing control. Neighbors began hiring Grant to break and train their horses because the quiet boy could do what louder men could not. This was not merely a charming talent from a president's childhood. On a frontier farm, the horse was transportation, pulling power, and stored labor. If the team failed, the plow stopped. The wagon stayed empty. The family lost time it might not recover before weather changed. A capable horseman carried adult responsibility long before adulthood. Grant later became famous for his ability to remain calm in situations that would normally cause other men to panic. During the Civil War, that calm could look almost unnatural. But a boy who had spent years behind teams learned that panic travels down the reins. He also learned the importance of prioritizing tasks. Animals fed, loads balanced, roads judged, and work completed in the right order. Grant's frontier childhood was not the bleakest on this list. He remembered considerable freedom and little punishment. That may have mattered. He learned responsibility without learning to perform toughness for its own sake. The frontier taught Ulysses Grant that real strength was not force, it was control. Number 2. Andrew Jackson, the Orphan of the Revolution. The Carolina backcountry where Andrew Jackson grew up was not a quiet edge of settlement. During the American Revolution, it became a civil war inside the larger war. Patriot and loyalist neighbors raided one another, farms burned, men disappeared into militia bands. Violence arrived without uniforms and did not remain on a distant battlefield. Jackson's father died before he was born. His oldest brother died after the Battle of Stono Ferry. Then in 1781, 14-year-old Andrew and his brother Robert were captured by British troops after serving with American irregulars. According to the account preserved by Jackson's family and early biographers, a British officer ordered the boy to clean his boots. Jackson refused. The officer struck him with a sword, cutting his hand and head. Jackson carried the scars for the rest of his life. Both brothers contracted smallpox in captivity. Their mother secured their release in a prisoner exchange, but Robert died soon afterward. She then went to aid relatives and sick prisoners near Charleston, contracted disease, and died as well. Before Andrew Jackson turned 15, his immediate family was gone. This was frontier survival at its most brutal. There was no protected childhood to return to after the fighting. An orphan depended on extended kin, nerve, and whatever usefulness he could offer. Jackson drifted, taught school briefly, read law, and then crossed the mountains into the Tennessee settlements. He entered adulthood already convinced that safety belonged to the person who could seize and hold it. That conviction made him formidable. It also made him dangerous. As a general and president, Jackson treated resistance as something to be broken. The same refusal to submit that had sustained a wounded prisoner later hardened into policies that devastated native nations, most notoriously removal from their homelands. Frontier experience can forge courage without producing mercy. Jackson understood loss, humiliation, and the fear of being powerless. He spent the rest of his life making certain that no officer, opponent, bank, tribe, or political rival could place him in that position again. The frontier taught Andrew Jackson how to survive, but it never taught him when to stop fighting. Number 1. Abraham Lincoln, the Rail Splitter. In December 1816, 7-year-old Abraham Lincoln crossed the Ohio River with his family and entered the timber country of southern Indiana. His father had claimed 160 acres near Little Pigeon Creek. On paper, it was land. On the ground, it was towering hardwood, tangled roots, wet hollows, brush, and a cold winter. Before the Lincolns could plant, they had to make a place where planting was possible. Trees came down by axe, logs became walls, clay and mud filled gaps. A spring supplied water 300 yards from the home site. The cabin was one room with no glass windows, a sleeping loft reached by pegs in the wall, and at first a dirt floor. Lincoln later described himself as almost constantly handling the axe against the trees and bogs and grubs of what he called the unbroken wilderness. That came from Lincoln himself, not from a campaign poster. The rail splitter image was polished for politics in 1860, but the labor underneath it was real. He worked beside his father. He plowed, planted, hired himself to neighbors, hauled, ferried passengers, and split the rails needed to fence fields. A rail fence was not decoration. Without it, livestock entered corn. A family could lose months of labor in a single night. Each straight section had to be read inside the grain of a log, opened with wedges and worked down into usable rails. Swing badly and the axe glanced. Read the timber badly and the split ran out. Then came loss. In 1818, milk sickness moved through the settlement. Lincoln's mother, Nancy, died when he was 9. Relatives in the same community died as well. There was no doctor who could name the poisoned milk or trace it to white snake root eaten by cattle. The family buried Nancy on a wooded rise. For months, the cabin fell into a rougher existence until Thomas Lincoln returned from Kentucky with a new wife, Sarah Bush Johnston, and her children. Lincoln's schooling amounted to less than a year when all the scattered terms were added together. Frontier work did not pause because a boy wanted to read. So he learned, in his phrase, by littles. A borrowed book near the fire, a page after labor, arithmetic scratched out when another task was not waiting. The same hands that drove wedges through oak learned to shape sentences with unusual precision. When the family moved again in 1830, this time to Illinois, Lincoln was 21. He helped build another cabin, break ground, plant corn, and make enough rails to fence 10 acres. A year later, he left to make his own way. Then, the frontier had already given him the central experience of his life. Progress was not a sudden rescue. It was the next hard stroke, followed by another long after the novelty had disappeared. That lesson followed him into the Civil War. Lincoln endured generals who failed, elections that threatened his office, casualty lists that reached the White House in bundles, and a union that repeatedly seemed close to breaking. He could change course without abandoning the work. He could absorb grief. He knew that some jobs were too large to finish quickly, too necessary to leave unfinished. The rail splitter was campaign language. The endurance was real, and the frontier did not teach Abraham Lincoln how to lead, taught him how to endure. 7 men, 7 different frontiers. Fillmore found education beside a machine that was supposed to consume his life. Polk watched wilderness become surveyed land, fenced fields, and an expanding national ambition. Hoover learned that family could vanish and usefulness could become a kind of shelter. Garfield discovered the true cost of unskilled labor on a muddy towpath. Grant learned calm behind a team of horses. Jackson learned survival in a war that took everyone he loved. Lincoln learned that the largest work is completed one blow at a time. They did not all become good men in the same ways. Frontier hardship did not automatically create wisdom, justice, or mercy. Sometimes it produced patience, sometimes ambition, sometimes a hardness that injured others. But every man on this list understood something modern leaders can spend an entire life avoiding. Hard work was not a philosophy to them. It was not a speech about values. It was the woodpile before winter, the field before rain, the wagon before dark, the sick child miles from a doctor, and the knowledge that unfinished work could cost a family its food, its home, or its future. That experience followed them into the White House. The scale changed, but the old lesson remained. Responsibility belonged to the person still standing when the easy choices were gone. Which of these 7 frontier stories surprised you the most? Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'll see you in the next one.